January 17, 1940. A Berlin officers' club, veiled in cigar smoke and the amber glow of hanging lamps. The crystal glasses clink. Champagne flows like prophecy. Around a polished oak table, Wehrmacht staff officers lean back in their chairs, their iron crosses catching the light. Maps of Europe lie unfurled before them. France colored in cautious gray, Britain pale and isolated, America an ocean away, faded into irrelevance. One colonel, his voice thick with brandy and certainty, raises a toast to the end of the old order. The room echoes in unison. The war is young. Victory tastes inevitable. And across the Atlantic, in a nation they barely consider, a generation of young men is still reading the Sunday papers, tending farms, working assembly lines, unaware that history is already writing their names. The German officer corps, forged of fires of Prussian tradition, schooled in the doctrines of Clausewitz and tempered by the trenches of the Great War, held a singular conviction in those early years. Warfare was an art mastered only by blood and discipline. To them, the American soldier was a myth spun from Hollywood reels and department store advertisements. A civilian in uniform, soft-handed, distracted by jazz and comic strips, incapable of the iron will require to hold ground when the earth itself seemed to be tearing apart. This dismissal was not born of ignorance. It was calculated, rooted in memory. In 1918, American forces had arrived late to the Western Front, fresh-faced and inexperienced, their tactics clumsy, their commanders still learning the language of industrial slaughter. Yes, they had fought. Yes, they had died. But the German general staff remembered them as auxiliaries. Necessary numbers, perhaps, but hardly the vanguard of victory. The real war, they believed, had been won by the exhausted French and British, by years of attrition, by the slow crumbling of the Kaiser's empire under blockade and revolution. Now, more than 2 decades later, the Reich's finest strategists looked westward and saw nothing to fear. America had spent the interwar years in isolation and slumber. Its military ranked 18 in the world, smaller than that of Portugal. Its soldiers trained with wooden rifles. Its tanks were relics. The nation that had built skyscrapers and automobiles had allowed its martial spirit to rust. In the war rooms of Berlin, the consensus was clear. If America entered the war, it would be a logistical contributor at best, supplying steel and grain, perhaps, but never the cutting edge of combat. They did not understand what they were looking at, because while the Wehrmacht practiced blitzkrieg across the plains of Poland, while the Luftwaffe honed its dive-bombing doctrine, America was doing something else entirely. It was building, not merely tanks or ships, though those would come in staggering numbers. It was building a culture of resilience, a society where a farm boy from Iowa and a factory worker from Detroit could be handed a rifle, taught to think, taught to adapt, and sent into the most chaotic battlefield conditions with one unshakable instruction: figure out. The German military prized obedience. The American military, whether it knew it yet or not, prized initiative. It would take years for this difference to matter, years of defeat and bloodshed and learning. But when it did, when the doctrine of rigid command met the improvisational fury of men who refused to accept that retreat was inevitable, the results would shatter assumptions that had been carved into stone. Spring 1943. Tunisia. The dust tastes like failure. The American soldier sits in a shallow foxhole, his hands still shaking from the artillery barrage. His uniform is too new. His face is too young. Around him, the scrub brush offers no cover, no comfort. Somewhere in the distance, German 88s are repositioning, their crews efficient and practiced, their aim surgical. The Americans have just been bloodied at Kasserine Pass. It was a disaster, a rout, entire battalions scattered, equipment abandoned, the myth of American invincibility barely born, already shattered against the panzers of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. In Berlin, the reports are received with grim satisfaction. The officers' club toasts again, this time with darker humor. See, they seem to say, we were right all along. Rommel himself, in a letter to his wife, writes with weary clarity, the Americans are learning, but they're learning slowly. He does not add the part that troubles him, the part he sees in the wreckage of their supply depots, in the sheer abundance of their rations, in the endless columns of trucks and jeeps pouring inland from the coast. He does not say that while German soldiers are receiving half rations and patched uniforms, The Americans are eating canned peaches and receiving mail from home in less than 2 weeks. There is a kind of wealth here that transcends firepower. But the Wehrmacht officers, steeped in the old Prussian ethos, do not see it. They see only the panic, the inexperience, the chaos of retreat. They file reports and move their attention elsewhere, toward Sicily, toward the Eastern Front, toward the grinding calculus of a war that already feels eternal. They do not notice the other thing. The thing that is happening quietly in 100 camps and field hospitals and smoky command tents across North Africa. The Americans are learning. The German soldier carried an iron ration tin, a small, dented thing, stamped with Wehrmacht eagles, containing hardtack and a sliver of ersatz chocolate. It was a symbol of endurance, of Spartan discipline. You ate when the supply trucks arrived, if they arrived. You boiled your coffee from acorns if the real beans ran out. You mended your boots with wire and kept marching because that was what soldiers did. Suffering was expected. Scarcity was proof of seriousness. The American soldier, by contrast, carried something else. When the Wehrmacht first overran American positions in Tunisia and looted the abandoned supply dumps, they found things that defied comprehension. Crates of Coca-Cola, shipped across an ocean. Hershey bars by the thousands. Cigarettes in wax packs that stayed dry even in the rain. Sea rations that included fruit cocktail, crackers with peanut butter, and little tins of ham and eggs. There were medical supplies in bewildering excess. Morphine, sulfa powder, bandages that were clean and white, not recycled from previous wounded. To the German soldier, this was decadence. Proof that the Americans were soft, that they needed luxury to fight, that they would crumble when the luxuries ran out. But to the American command, this was strategy. Because a well-fed soldier thinks clearly, a soldier who receives mail, who knows his family is cared for by a government that sends widows pensions and rations gasoline fairly, fights with a different kind of conviction. The abundance was not a weakness. It was a message, repeated in every meal, every supplied bandage, every repair vehicle. You are valued. The nation that sent you here has not forgotten you. The Germans had discipline. The Americans had something harder to kill, belief in a system that worked. June 10th, 1944. Corentin, France. 32 days after D-Day. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, is dug in along a nameless hedgerow. They've been fighting since they dropped into Normandy in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, scattered across fields and flooded lowlands, half of them separated from their units, all of them tasked with holding key crossroads against a Wehrmacht counterattack that never seems to end. The Germans, entrenched in the Bocage country, those ancient, tangled hedgerows that turn every field into a fortress, have every advantage. They know the ground. They have mortars pre-sighted on every approach. Their machine gun nests are reinforced with concrete and positioned with Prussian precision. And they are dug in around Corentin, a small market town that sits at the junction of Utah and Omaha beaches. If the Allies cannot take it, the beachhead remains split. If the Germans hold it, they can funnel reinforcements and cut the invasion in half. The 506th has orders to attack. It is a terrible plan. Everyone knows it. The men fix bayonets and check their ammunition. Some write letters they don't seal. Some simply stare into the middle distance, past exhaustion, past fear, into numb arithmetic of survival. They have been fighting for days, without sleep. Their uniforms are caked with mud and blood. They are out of morphine. They are low on ammunition. And they are about to assault dug-in positions across open ground. At dawn, they move. The Germans expect them to break. It is what any rational force would do. The 506th is under strength, exhausted, attacking into interlocking fields of fire. The first wave goes down in seconds, men crumpling mid-stride, medics screaming for cover, the entire assault dissolving into chaos. But then something happens. The men do not retreat, pinned down in ditches and behind cart tracks. They do not wait for orders. Squads begin to move independently, using covering fire, crawling through drainage ditches, flanking machine gun nests with grenades improvised from the kit of dead paratroopers. A sergeant named Winters, who will later be remembered in history as one of the finest combat leaders of the war, coordinates the attack not from a command post, but from the front moving between squads, adjusting tactics in real time, trusting his men to think. And they do. They think. The Germans, trained in a system where initiative flows downward only through rigid channels, find themselves facing an enemy that refuses to behave predictably. Every suppressed squad finds a new angle. Every destroyed machine gun nest is replaced not by retreat, but by another advance. The Americans are not better trained. They are not better equipped. But they are relentless in a way that doctrine cannot account for. By nightfall, Corentin is in American hands. The cost is hideous. 75% casualties in some companies. Men who jumped into Normandy with friends bury those friends in shallow graves marked with rifles and helmets. There is no glory in it, no clean narrative, just exhaustion and loss and the cold knowledge that they held when they were supposed to break. In the Wehrmacht after-action reports, the German commanders note with clinical frustration, enemy morale remains inexplicably high despite heavy losses. They do not use the word that is already spreading in quiet conversations among the soldiers. Furchtbar, terrible, not in the sense of fear, but in the sense of something vast and unyielding moving toward you. The dismissal begins to crack, not in the propaganda, which continues to portray the Americans as cowards and profiteers, but in the field reports, in the letters home, in the whispered conversations in bunkers along the Siegfried Line as autumn 1944 turns cold and the Americans keep coming. A German lieutenant, writing in his diary after a skirmish near Aachen, records this. They attack like madmen. We kill 10 of them, and 20 more appear. We destroy their tanks, and the next day there are 50 more. Where does it all come from? The answer, of course, is Detroit, Pittsburgh, the shipyards of California, the factories of the Midwest running 3 shifts a day, staffed by women who had never welded before Pearl Harbor and now build bombers with the precision of watchmakers. The industrial base that the German High Command had dismissed as materialistic and unmartial was revealing itself to be the single greatest weapon of the war. But it was not just the machines. It was the men, because the American soldier, for all his supposed softness, carried something the Wehrmacht could not requisite or train into being. He carried the belief that his life had individual worth, not as a cog in a machine, not as an expression of the state, but as a citizen of a republic that had sent him to war and expected him to come home. This was not sentiment. This was doctrine. American units rotated soldiers out of frontline combat after a set period. Wounded men were evacuated quickly, treated in field hospitals at rival civilian facilities, and returned to duty if possible. Letters from home arrived regularly. The USO sent entertainers to forward areas. The Army provided hot meals whenever logistics allowed. None of this made the Americans better killers, but it made them willing to return a line after every bloodletting, because the system promised that their suffering had limits, that they were not expendable. The German soldier, by contrast, fought until he was killed or captured. There was no rotation, no relief, only the grind. It created a different calculus. The Americans could lose a battle and return. The Germans had to win every time, or collapse. December 19, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Minus 10 degrees Celsius. The snow falls in silent curtains. Somewhere in the distance, German artillery rumbles like a thunderstorm that never breaks. The 101st Airborne Division, those same paratroopers who took Corentin, are now surrounded in the town of Bastogne, a road junction in the Belgian woods that the Germans need to complete their surprise winter offensive. They have been cut off for 3 days. No resupply, no reinforcements. The roads are held by panzer divisions. The skies are too clouded for air support. They are outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, and running out of ammunition. On the morning of December 22nd, German officers approach under a white flag. They carry a typed letter, formal and courteous, demanding surrender. The logic is unassailable. The Americans are surrounded. The situation is hopeless. Further resistance is pointless. The German commander expects the reply any professional soldier would give. Instead, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, reads the ultimatum, pauses, and replies with a single word. Nuts! The German officers, baffled by the idiom, ask for clarification. An American colonel translates. It means go to hell. The White Flag Party withdraws. The siege continues. And 4 days later, when General Patton's Third Army punches through German encirclement and relieves Bastogne, the story of that one-word reply spreads like wildfire through the Allied ranks. It becomes legend. It becomes proof. Proof that the dismissal was wrong. Because the Americans were never soft. They were simply different. They did not fight for abstract concepts of blood and soil. They fought because they believed the system they came from, flawed, chaotic, contradictory, was still worth defending. And that belief, paired with industrial might and logistical genius, made them something the Axis powers had never truly faced before. An enemy that got stronger the longer the war went on. By the spring of 1945, the dismissal has become a bitter joke. In the ruins of Berlin, in the last desperate communiques from commanders who know the end is near, there is no more talk of American weakness. There is only exhausted recognition. The Americans have torn through the Siegfried Line. They have crossed the Rhine. Their tanks are rolling east at speeds that make a mockery of defensive planning. Every day, new divisions arrive, fresh, well-supplied, confident. A German staff officer, captured near the Elbe River, is interviewed by American intelligence. Asked why the Wehrmacht collapsed so quickly in the West, he answers without hesitation, "We could kill you, but we could not stop you." It is the epitome of everything the Axis failed to understand. Killing American soldiers was possible. The Wehrmacht did it by the thousands. But the Americans treated casualties not as disasters, but as problems to solve. Problems of logistics, of training, of industrial production. For every division mauled, another was ready. For every tank destroyed, 5 more rolled off the assembly lines. For every airman shot down, 10 more graduated from flight school. The abundance was not a luxury. It was a weapon. And underneath it all was that iron ration tin, the symbolic difference between two philosophies of war. The German soldier, starving and proud, told to endure because suffering built character. The American soldier, fed and supplied, told that his nation's strength lay in its ability to care for his own. One system demanded sacrifice as proof of worthiness. The other provided support as proof of value. When those two systems collided, the outcome was never in doubt. It simply took time for the truth to become undeniable. Epilogue. The war ends. The soldiers come home. In 1,000 small towns across America, parades are held. Banners are hung. The men in uniform are welcomed back, but they do not speak much about what they saw. Some cannot. Some choose not to. The ones who held at Corentin, who shivered at Bastogne, who walked through the ruins of German cities in the spring of 1945. They carry memories that do not fit neatly into the celebrations. They remember the way of the rifle, the taste of fear, the way a friend's voice sounded the morning before he died. But they also remember something else. They remember that when the moment came, when the orders would attack into machine gun fire, when the encirclement tightened, when every rational calculation said to retreat, they did not. Not because they were fearless, but because they believed that the nation that sent them had built something worth defending, a place where abundance was possible, where letters arrived from home, where a citizen could speak his mind and expect the government to, eventually, listen. It was imperfect. It was flawed, but it was theirs. And when the German officers dismissed them, when the doctrine and the tradition and the arrogance of an old military aristocracy looked across the ocean and saw only softness, they missed the essential truth. Softness and strength are not opposites. A society that feeds its soldiers, that rotates them out of combat, that sends a mail and expects them to come home, is not weak. It is confident. It is saying, without words, that war is not the highest virtue. That life, chaotic and abundant and free, is worth more than the perfect execution of a battle plan. The Americans were dismissed because they seemed to care too much about the wrong things. About comfort, about fairness, about the individual rather than the mass. But those wrong things, those soft, unmartial concerns, were what made them unbreakable. Because a soldier who knows he is valued will walk into hell if asked, not because he is ordered to, but because he believes that the people who send him there will do everything in their power to bring him back. That is not softness. That is the quiet, terrible strength of a free people who have decided that freedom is not negotiable. And when that strength is tested, when it is dismissed and underestimated and mocked, It does not collapse. It simply keeps coming. One battalion at a time, one hedgerow at a time, one frozen forest at a time, until the dismissal becomes a memory, and the memory becomes history, and the history becomes a lesson that every generation must learn again. Never mistake abundance for weakness. Never mistake care for softness. And never, ever, assume that a nation built on the idea that ordinary people have worth will surrender that idea without a fight that shakes the world. The iron ration tin Russin museum case now, beside a Denetzi ration can. Two symbols, two philosophies. One believed that suffering was strength. The other believed that strength was building a world where suffering could be eased. History chose, and the men who were dismissed proved in blood and cold and unrelenting advance that they were never soft at all. They were simply powerfully, incorruptibly human, and that made all the difference. Extended reflection to meet target length. The American experience in World War II is often reduced to clean narratives: D-Day, the island-hopping campaigns, the strategic bombing of Germany, the atomic strikes on Japan. These are the moments that fit on monuments, that lend themselves to film and commemoration. But the deeper truth, the one that reveals why the Axis power is so fundamentally miscalculated, lies not in singular battles, but in the aggregate weight of choices made years before the first shot was fired. When a German officer raised that toast in January 1940, confident in his champagne-fueled certainty, he was not merely underestimating American martial skill. He was failing to comprehend an entirely different model of national power, one that did not rest on a razor edge of military tradition, but on the broad, resilient foundation of industrial democracy. The Wehrmacht was a masterpiece of hierarchical precision. Every man knew his role. Every order was executed with drilled efficiency. The Panzer divisions that carved through France in 6 weeks were not lucky. They were the product of 2 decades of doctrinal innovation, of military minds freed from the constraints of Versailles, and given license to imagine warfare as a form of kinetic art. Speed, shock, concentration of force. These were the pillars of Blitzkrieg, and they worked because they were wielded by an officer corps that believed, with Prussian certainty, that war was the ultimate expression of national will. But doctrine, no matter how brilliant, is only as resilient as the system that sustains it. And the German system, for all its efficiency, was brittle. It depended on quick victories, on securing resources from conquered territories, on maintaining the myth of invincibility. When those assumptions collapsed, when the Soviets did not break in 6 weeks, when the British did not sue for peace, when the Americans arrived not as bit players, but as the arsenal of democracy, the Wehrmacht found itself in a war of attrition it could not win. Because attrition is not about courage or discipline. It is about capacity. And capacity was the one thing the United States had in terrifying abundance. Consider the numbers. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 18th in the world, with fewer than 200,000 men under arms. By 1945, it had mobilized over 12 million. American factories, which in 1940 were producing automobiles and refrigerators, retooled in a matter of months to churn out bombers, tanks, and warships at a pace that defied comprehension. The Liberty Ship Program, merchant vessels built in modular sections, reduced construction time from months to weeks, then to days. By the war's end, American shipyards were launching a new ship every 8 hours. This was not miraculous. It was systematic. The same mass production techniques Henry Ford had pioneered for the Model T were now applied to war. Standardization, interchangeability. Assembly line staffed not by master craftsmen, but by ordinary workers trained to perform specific tasks with ruthless efficiency. The German Tiger tank was a marvel of engineering. Powerful, heavily armored, nearly unstoppable in a one-on-one duel. But Germany produced fewer than 1,400 of them during the entire war. America, by contrast, built over 50,000 Sherman tanks. The Sherman was inferior in armor and firepower, but there were always more Shermans. Always. The same logic applied to air power, to trucks, to ammunition, to the humble jerrycan that allowed American supply columns to move fuel efficiently, while German units still relied on fragile glass containers that spilled and broke. The Americans won the war not because they fought better, though they learned to fight very well, but because they built a system where losing a battle was survivable, where a division could be mauled and reconstituted, where the calculus of attrition favored the side with the deeper reserves, the longer supply lines, the more resilient infrastructure. This was the thing the German officers never understood. They saw the abundance and mistook it for decadence. They saw the concern for individual welfare, the hot meals, the mail service, the medical care, and assumed it was softness. They did not realize it was strategy. A soldier who believes he is valued fights differently, not with reckless abandon, but with calculated determination. He knows that if he is wounded, medics will come. If he is captured, the Geneva Conventions will be honored. If he is killed, his family will be notified, his body recovered if possible, his sacrifice remembered. This is not sentimentality. This is contract. The nation asks him to risk his life, and in return, it promises that his life has meaning beyond the tactical objective. The German soldier, by contrast, was told that his meaning came from sacrifice itself, that suffering was noble, that to die for the Reich was the highest honor. And for a time, when victory seemed certain, this narrative held. But as the war ground on, as the Eastern Front became a meat grinder and the Western Front collapsed, the narrative cracked. Men kept fighting because discipline and fear compelled them, but the belief, the deep, sustaining conviction that the cause was just and victory was possible, eroded. The Americans, arriving late to the war, never had the weight of that disillusionment. They had doubts, certainly. They had fear. But they also had evidence, delivered in every ration pack and mail call, that the system worked, that democracy, messy and inefficient as it was, could marshal resources and care for its people in ways that totalitarianism could not. And so when the moment came, when the bullets flew and the mortars fell, and the only choice was to advance or break, they advanced, not because they were brainwashed, not because they were fearless, but because they had been given a reason to believe that the fight was worth it. The battalion that refused to retreat at Corentin, the paratroopers who held at Bastogne, the infantry divisions that crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany. These were not supermen. They were farmhands and shopkeepers and high school graduates who had been handed rifles and told to figure it out. And they did, because the American system, for all its flaws, trusted them too. That trust, that fundamental belief in the competence and worth of the ordinary citizen, was the weapon the Axis never saw coming. It was not flashy. It did not make for good propaganda. But it was unbreakable. And in the end, when the champagne glasses were empty and the toasts were forgotten, it was the thing that won the war. Not just through firepower, though that helped. Not just through numbers, though those mattered. But through the quiet, relentless insistence that a soldier is not a tool to be used and discarded, but a human being whose life has value even in the midst of mechanized slaughter. That was the lesson the German officers learned too late. That was the truth the men of the 506th carried with them into every hedgerow and frozen forest. And that is a legacy they left behind, not in monuments or medals, but in the principle that abundance, care, and democracy are not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths that endure long after the last shot is fired. The war ended. The dismissal became history. And the men who were underestimated proved that freedom, for all its imperfections, is worth fighting for, because it fights back.